Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Conservation Connect Dogs Detecting Data with Kayla Fratt, co founder of Canine Conservationist. Thank you so much for being here today, Kayla.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Brooke. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. So I have the pleasure of knowing you very well and had the opportunity to sit on K9's board for some years. But I want everybody to get to know you and your amazing background. So tell us a little about yourself. How did you get into conservation work and specifically conservation dog detection work?
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up on 40 acres in northern Wisconsin, and my dad is a conservation biologist. At the time, he was a fisheries biologist. He's also worked in forestry. And so I kind of grew up in it. I grew up catching frogs and chasing butterflies and monitoring bird nests and whatnot. One of my favorite memories from being a child is I think I was underfoot with my dad a little bit too much as a young kid. And he gave me a bunch of live traps and set me out to catch all of the chipmunks on our property and then mark them with a permanent marker and then release them and then continue doing that to do like a mark recapture study of how many chipmunks we had on the property. And I think this was just a way to get me out from under his feet over summer break when I was like 8 or 10. Um, but yeah, so I grew up very much so playing outdoors, falling in love with nature, falling in love with, I loved Steve Irwin, I loved Jane Goodall. So I went to Colorado College for undergrad with a degree, with the goal of getting a degree in ecology. And throughout my time at Colorado College, I needed a way to pay my way through school. I had really, really good financial aid, but you still need some additional support in some cases. So I actually started a dog walking business, which very quickly turned into a dog training business. And then I spent about 3 years of my undergrad pursuing these dual interests. I was spending all morning in class learning about ecology and conservation biology, and I was also taking classes on like learning theory and neuroethology, mammalogy, all of these things. And then in the evenings, I was going out and I was training people's dogs. And as I got closer and closer to graduation, I didn't really know which direction I wanted to go. I kept having people suggest to me that I stick with the dog route, which was encouraging, but I also felt like I had just spent 4 years working on this whole conservation biology thing. And I was very much so someone, I was also a young activist. I had been kind of involved in the climate movement. I was really concerned about biodiversity loss. And the idea of just spending my time training dogs for the rest of my life didn't quite do it for me. So around that same time, a friend found a video of a dog that was being trained to sniff out orca scat on the Salish Sea outside of Washington, off of the coast of Washington. And I immediately knew that was what I wanted to do. It was like, oh my God. So I've got the dog training, I've got the conservation biology, I get the travel, I get to do field work. This has got to be it for me. Um, Spoiler, it took me about 4 years between seeing that YouTube video and actually getting a job in the field. Um, but that was kind of the path that led me towards at least hearing about conservation detection dogs and realizing that was what I wanted to be getting into.
Oh, how cool when you can combine two passions. You're like light bulb, and that YouTube video was your light bulb moment. So then what inspired you to co-found Canine Conservationists? Was there then like a specific moment that solidified that passion for conservation detection dogs?
Yeah, yes and no. So basically, from that moment where I saw that video, I was a junior in college at the time. So I tried to figure out if I could do a summer internship with a conservation dog organization. Maybe someone was taking volunteers. I wasn't able to make any of those connections. Basically, everyone that I reached out to was like, yeah, great, but we're busy. We don't really take volunteers. Good luck. Um, and then I finished up my years at Colorado College. I got my degree. I went on to work at a conservation advocacy organization doing political work for the state of Colorado for conservation, clean air, clean water, public lands, public transit, those sorts of things. And then after that, I got a job at Denver Dumb Friends League, which is a huge animal shelter in the Denver area. they see about 20,000 animals a year, and they have an amazing behavior team. So I was one of 8 full-time staff members whose entire job was to just train the dogs and cats that come through the doors. And we primarily worked with the at-risk population within the shelter. So if you're like grandma passes away and her lovely dog ends up at the shelter, that dog can just go straight up for adoption potentially. What we were dealing with more the dogs that maybe had come from less advantaged situations, or had more behavioral issues. So we were training all day, every day. That's how I met Barley, who we'll talk about plenty today. He and I met at the animal shelter and I took him home. Um, and that gave me a ton more experience working with really intense dogs, which is really helpful for this line of work, as we'll talk about as we go. And then so I was basically trying to figure out, okay, if I want to get into the conservation dog world, what are all the different pieces of experience that I need to get that I can pull together to get into the world of conservation detection dogs? Well, we won't go too far into it, but basically I ended up meeting working dogs for conservation through the process of I was writing a grant to go work with conservation dogs, hopefully in New Zealand. I was applying for a Fulbright scholarship. And through the process of that, I reached out to Working Dogs for Conservation and asked them what their pain points were in their organization. And basically, I was trying to figure out, can I write this grant so that I go spend this year learning about this problem that somebody in the industry has? I made it to the semifinalist stage of the Fulbright, and around that time, the executive director of Working Dogs for Conservation reached out to me and said that I had a job with them if I was interested. So I got really, really lucky with that. I ended up spending about a year and a half working for Working Dogs for Conservation. I learned so much from them. They are really an incredible group of people. I ended up losing that job in November of 2020 during the height of the pandemic, and basically entered a really dark place because I felt like I had made it. I had finally attained this dream that I'd been working on. I was in my mid to late 20s at this point and was just like, oh my God, I've fumbled the ball. Like this is such a small field. It is so competitive. I have no idea how I'm going to get back on my feet and get back into this line of work. And it's COVID and everything is falling apart. Um, and I spent like 4 months feeling pretty sorry for myself and then decided to found Canine Conservationists. So I reached out to 2 of my good friends within the industry, one of whom was primarily a dog trainer, one of whom was primarily an ecologist, and I asked them if they would be interested in going down this road with me. And that was March of 2021, and we've been together now for it'll be 4 years in a couple weeks now. So I never actually intended to go out and start my own organization. I very much so had intended to be part of a team and wanted to be part of something larger, but that wasn't really a long-term option that I ended up having. So we went our own way.
Yeah, and you three are doing amazing work, knowing all
Yeah.
three of you personally. It's very inspiring. So now that we know the people side a little bit, we know you, your team, Canine Conservationists, let's start talking about the dogs, what we're all so excited to learn about today. So, what role do detection dogs play in collecting scientific data compared to maybe some other survey methods and techniques?
Yeah. So broadly, detection dogs fall into this bucket of like non-invasive sampling for ecology. So other things that you might have heard of within that line of work are things like camera traps, where you set a camera out, it takes photos either at a set interval or when something walks by and triggers a motion sensor. Hair boards can also be non-invasive sampling. So you've just got something out in the environment, and when a bear chooses to scratch itself on it, you get some hair and you can use that to look at DNA. And that is kind of compared to something like a GPS collar, which is more invasive, where you've actually got to go and you've got to capture the animal. You might try while that animal is down, because you'll actually put them to sleep for a couple hours or a couple minutes at least while you're doing this. You'll take their blood, you'll look at their teeth, you'll get weight, you'll look at parasites, and then you fit them with that GPS collar, which tells you where they're going at fixed intervals for however long that collar lasts. So what detection dogs do, their superpower is they are really good at finding stuff for biologists. And where they come in is basically when other techniques aren't as effective at finding whatever it is needs to be found. So that could be something like the tiny, tiny baby invasive plant that, if missed, would then grow up and drop 10,000 seeds. And then next year, you've got a much bigger problem with invasive plants. It could be a really, really tiny, rare, endangered mussel that you want to be able to identify so that then you can not disturb a certain part of a stream. But a lot of what we do is um, so basically, dogs are really, really good at finding poop. The pink arrow in that photo points to a wolf scat that Barley had just located for me there. And conservation detection dogs have exploded in the past 20, 25, 30 years. Gosh, I'm used to saying 20, but it's really getting closer to 30 years. Um, because of the growth of our ability to capture non-invasive DNA from feces. So if you think back 40 years ago, if I had a pile of wolf poop, um, basically all I would be able to say is, okay, cool, there was a wolf here. I might be able to do what's called mechanical sorting, which is basically a fancy version of washing and sieving and washing and sieving and then pulling out bones and trying to identify what that animal ate. But that's about what we could do with it. Nowadays, we can get so much more information out of a single scat sample. So we can identify much more specifically what that animal was eating because we don't have to rely on there being like a diagnostic piece of bone that we find. We can actually just get little snippets of DNA. We can figure out their sex. In some cases, we can look at things like reproductive status. We can look at who they're related to. And then if we're able to recapture the same individual, find the scat from the same individual over the course of various areas, then we can say, okay, this is where that individual is moving. If we find a relative, we can start building these maps of connectivity across the landscape. And all of that is possible, not just because of the dogs, but because of the DNA side of things and the advances that have been happening there. So that's why we really see the dogs and the non-invasive the dogs and the genetic monitoring growing together over these last 30 years.
Yeah, they're amazing. They're like a superpower or like a super secret technique that we now have in the back pockets in conservation science. It's so cool.
Absolutely.
And
I
then
mean, yeah,
I
sorry to cut you off, but I think
no,
this
go ahead.
photo is a great example of it. Like
Mhm.
here we've got a wolf scat, which is huge, compared to some of the things we look for. And it's literally in the middle of a road. And if I didn't have that arrow there, it's actually pretty hard to see. And you can imagine how easy it is as you get fatigued, as you've been out for hours, to walk right past something like that. And especially imagine if this was more overgrown, if there's more vegetation. We'll have some videos that show this later on. Humans just don't have a chance at finding these sorts of things. And we can take a dog out there and find things like some of the studies we've done, it's been, 13 times as effective to have a dog out there than a human without a dog. They're really, really, really good at what they do.
Yeah, as someone who has done some various field methods myself, like I can only imagine having a dog there. That would make it so much easier. But moving forward with these dogs, what makes a good conservation detection dog? Are there any specific breeds or traits that you're looking for when you're selecting a new dog to come onto the team?
Yeah, absolutely. So we primarily work with shelter dogs. We like being able to kind of find those dogs that didn't fit into a normal home. And as I described the dog, you might start understanding why these dogs don't necessarily fit into suburban life. Um, but we will work with breeders occasionally because there is something to be said for a purpose-bred dog with health testing. So the first thing we look for generally is like, okay, does this dog seem healthy and physically capable of doing the sort of work that we want it to do? So we're not necessarily going to be looking at like a bull mastiff or one of these other like 150-pound breeds. We're probably not going to be looking at the Chihuahuas, although I do have a dream of having like a pocket rocket little dog for the right project. It'll work. But we certainly wouldn't be looking at something like a dachshund, where, them jumping up and over logs over and over has high risk of spinal injuries. Their little leggies just can't keep up. So we start out with like, okay, at the top of the funnel, we need a dog that's physically capable of doing this line of work. And that can also come into play with breeds that are more what we start looking at. So then from there, we start looking at like breeds or breed mixes that might work for us. We tend to see a lot of the herding dogs and the sporting, like the gun dogs. So I work with border collies for the most part right now. The other popular breeds in our line of work are spaniels, labs. You see a fair number of German shepherds, pointers, those sorts of dogs. If you're thinking about either with a gun dog, a dog that's been bred to like go out and work with a person to find a thing and bring it back to them, it's pretty close to what we're doing. So that's really convenient as like a genetic package to help out. Versus the herding dogs, what we get with the herding dogs is they might not necessarily have that natural search instinct and that natural nose, although they do physiologically have a perfectly capable nose. But what they're really good at is being very responsive to their person around wildlife. Because if you imagine a herding dog needs to be responsive around sheep or goats or ducks, if they can genetically kind of be predisposed towards listening well around sheep or goats, you're more likely to have good luck with them around elk and whatnot as well. So then we kind of start looking at these breeds. And that's where then that health thing can kind of come back up because just because a dog's a border collie doesn't mean it's got good hips, doesn't mean it's got good elbows. And we don't want to be intentionally bringing a dog onto our team where the work we're asking them to do is physically painful for them and their body. That's just, that's not ethical. So we do want to make sure that they're physically capable of doing the work. They don't have any old injuries or maybe a genetic defect that would make it hard for them to do this job, even if they kind of have the desire to do it. Then we look at the desire. So what we basically do is we look for dogs that are over the top obsessed with fetch. And you can kind of take these things in either order as well. I've heard stories of handlers, 25 years ago, they would go to a shelter and they would take a ball and they would just throw it down the line of kennels and see which dogs like totally followed the ball and they would use that instead. I find it helpful to use the breed filters and then, starting to look through the bios. Like, does the shelter mention that this dog will do anything for a ball? Great. That dog might be one that's worth me emailing about. We also have a lot of considerations that we have to make regarding how the dog fits into our work and into our lives.
Mm.
So our dogs live at home with us. We don't have kennels. They sleep in our beds. And we generally have more than one dog. And I have a cat. My co-founder Heather has two cats. And we need them to be obviously safe around wildlife as well. So there's a lot of dogs who might be physically capable of doing the work and have the ball drive to do the work, but maybe don't like other dogs, maybe are scared of strangers, maybe are aggressive towards cats. And there's any number of reasons that a dog might kind of not make the cut for one of those reasons as well. So it's quite extensive when we're looking for a new dog. I find it easier to hire people than I do hiring dogs in
That's
some ways
impressive.
because the people you can actually ask questions. Um, and they can raise their hands and they come to you, they sign up, they apply, versus the dogs we have to be going back and forth with fosters or rescues and ask them all sorts of questions that are really weird. We're like, hey, have you ever seen this dog? Like, I mean, does this dog chase squirrels? And a lot of people will be like, yeah. Like, okay, go, what does that look like? Like, does it look like something that we think is trainable? And we do all sorts of hunt tests where we ask them to like go and hide the ball from the dog and then cover the dog's eyes and spin the dog in a circle 3 times and then send the dog out. We're doing all these like crazy aptitude tests and bless the shelter workers who help us out with screening these dogs. It's a lot. It's a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But just like you said, like you want to make sure you find a dog that's going to love doing their job just as much, both directions. So let's say that
Yeah.
you have found a new dog or like beautiful Barley here, such a sweetie. Could you walk us through the training process? How do you teach a dog to detect specific scents? Because there's so many scents.
Yeah.
They have one scent they need to detect. How do they go out and do that? How do you train them to do that?
Yeah, great. So I've actually got a video for us here. I'll skip ahead. We've already covered a lot of this. Okay, so this video is going to show the process with my puppy Niffler. Niffler is our only dog that we got from a breeder, so it's going to start out and I'll start narrating. When he was 5 weeks old, I went and met him and all of his litter mates, and I presented them with an impossible to solve food puzzle, which is what he's working on here. Um, and basically, what I was looking for is the puppy in the litter that had the most tenacity and different and creativity in their problem solving. So I ended up taking Niffler home out of those 7 puppies in that litter. And then when he was just a little itty baby, I think he's like 10 weeks old here, I'm just teaching him to check different buckets for food. So all he's learning is how to go down a line and find the food and then work cooperatively with me as I go and put him back into his kennel. And I think this shows a couple more repetitions. And he's learning things like how to wait patiently, how to use his nose to find things in the environment, and how to cooperate with me through that process. You can see he's kind of like, do I really have to go back in and start it over? And then we also do a lot of toy skills at this age or at this stage. If he had been 2 years old, we would be doing the same process. He just wouldn't be quite as cute doing it. But here he's learning how to play tug with me and that I am a fun person to come back and interact with because it's really important that they don't just go find the thing, but they actually tell us about it and come back and interact with us. So as he gets older here, so here he's 5-ish months old, he's learning how to search in more and more complicated environments. So yeah. And again, all of this is not necessarily strictly related to age. But here he's learning how to search more and more complicated and larger environments. And how to stay close enough to me in those areas that that we can work together effectively as a team, but not so close to me that he's not covering ground. And then finally here, we're starting to introduce him to a target odor. So I have 3 identical tins here, and one of them contains a dead bat, which was the first project that he worked on. Um, Working on wind farms, finding birds and bats that had been killed by the turbines. And basically what I'm doing here is it's almost like a shell game, but instead of him using it as a memory game where he needs to remember what was where, he needs to use his nose to sniff the correct one. And then something that's not shown here is that we were also training him the concept of an alert, which is teaching him that when you find that thing, when you put your nose on the correct thing, oh boy, right in here, you see his nose on the tin there. What we were also teaching him how to do is how to lie down with that tin in between his front paws. And again, that's not shown here. Oh gosh. We'll get back to where we were. And then here we're actually putting it all together. So you can see he's searching in a much larger environment. Again, there's no fences. We're also asking him to deal with a lot of distractions. You saw semis going by. There's a bike path behind us. And there is his bat somewhere right in here. And I cue him to lie down, which is his alert cue, and then he gets his ball. And then here, step 7, he's about 9 months old here. He's actually working on a wind farm at this point. And you can see he just hung a right and is going up to where that bat is. I didn't know this bat was here, just happened to catch this on video. He lies down and waits for me to come check it, and we give him his ball. So.
Wow. What an incredible process. So around how long then does it take, would you say, on average, for to get a dog ready to go into the field?
Yeah, it takes longer with puppies. That's one of the reasons we don't love actually working with puppies, because you're having to contend with the fact that, no matter how great they are when they're 9 weeks old, they just can't do stuff. Their brains and bodies just aren't caught up yet. It's like, it doesn't matter how hard you work with a kindergartner, you're not going to make them into a lawyer. Versus if you took like a relatively smart 30-year-old and started them out in law school, you could probably have a lawyer in 5 years, So similarly, so for our puppies, generally, we don't expect them to be doing work before a year and a half old. Niffler got to start a little bit early because of some specifics with that project. It was a really beginner-friendly project that he was on. But it's actually pretty common for dogs to not be full-time working until they're closer to like 3 or even 4 years old if you start them out as puppies. Versus if you adopt a 2-year-old shelter dog, we can have, depending on the complexity of the project we're preparing them for, we can have those dogs up and running and ready for their first project within like 2 months.
Wow.
Um, yeah, because and again, it depends so much. Some of our shelter dogs come to us already knowing a lot of things because they were really, really active dogs. And in a lot of cases, people tried really hard to figure out how to live with this hyperactive genius dog that they had accidentally acquired. So a lot of them already knew they know how to come when called, they know how to sit, they know how to stop, they know all sorts of things that we can then kind of co-opt and bring into our scent work training really, really quickly versus, the puppies, you're spending a bunch of time potty training them.
Yeah, very good point. And you've brought up this topic a few times, and I would love to spend a little bit more time on this because like looking at that environment that's behind you with barley, and just you're in wild places, like keeping our field biologists healthy is important, as well as our dogs. So how do you do that? How do you make sure that the dogs are well cared for and at their best and safe in the field?
Yeah. So again, that first step is trying the best we can to acquire a dog that doesn't have health issues that would make this job challenging for them. That doesn't mean that we need dogs that are perfect. Barley actually has had arthritis in his hips for several years now. We've got another dog who has a different hip condition as well. And we joke that we single-handedly keep a couple sports medicine veterinarian practices open because we are, like they're athletes, we're athletes. I also have a hip condition. I also have bumps and bruises and scrapes. So we try to select a dog that's going to be healthy, and then we work with sports medicine trainers to get the dogs ready to go, make sure that we're addressing any imbalances in their in kind of their body, and if there is an injury, coordinating on whether or not that dog is actually ready to go back into the field or not, and what it might look like to make sure that happens. Again, Barley actually tore his ACL a couple of years ago, so I worked with a sports medicine veterinarian for 3 months to do all of his physical therapy and get all these clearances to build him back up to getting back into the game. Um, and then when as we get closer and closer to being in the field, the other things that we work on are safety skills. So our dogs are taught to automatically disengage from livestock and wildlife. So they learn that if they see an elk, a bear, a deer, even like a ptarmigan or something where like the ptarmigan isn't going to harm the dog, but or an endangered plover, the dogs are trained to automatically disengage from that. We also will teach them both a recall and what we call a stop at a distance or an emergency stop, which is really useful for things like if we see a rattlesnake when we're out. Might not want the dog to recall back to us if that rattlesnake is in between us and them. That happens
Mm.
quite a lot because by the time I see the snake, the dog might have already passed it. So I want the dog to just stop, stay where they are, even if it's 50 meters away from me. I can come and collect them. So we work on all this training and all of these skills to make sure that the dogs are really safe and effective in the field. And then we also carry a ton of safety equipment. So like with my work in Alaska, I always have bear spray on me. That bear spray is right here. It's ready to go. If we suspect we're approaching a wolf den, we'll put the dog on leash. So we've got a couple different lengths of leash that allow the dog to work effectively while staying close to us and safer from wolves, because you never want to say that there's nothing could ever happen. We haven't had any injuries or any incidents, but it's not impossible. And then I also carry a huge first aid kit. So if you can see in my background here, barley is almost entirely on a bed of mussels here, and those are really sharp. So sometimes we'll put booties on them. He's not wearing booties in this photo. But we also carry a ton of gauze and first aid supplies. I have like a skin stapler, and I have all sorts of training to make sure I'm ready to use it if needed, if an injury were to occur. So we kind of everything from like years before the project starts to like day of in the project, there's all sorts of things that we're trying to do to mitigate risk. And so far we're pretty happy with how everything has gone. We've had very few incidences, but it's the reality is with field work, with playing outside in any capacity, like injuries are going to happen. They do happen. We just try to make sure we're avoiding them and prepared to deal with them when they do happen.
Yeah, so now that we have a good mindset of the dogs that you select and how they stay safe and everything and why they're important for science, let's talk about some projects. So, what kind of projects has canine conservationists worked on, and are there any that have stand out as like particularly impactful or rewarding for you and the team?
Yeah, so one of the ones that really stands out to me is actually our very first project. So our very first project as a team was with Action for Cheetahs in Kenya, which is an organization out of Kenya that works on cheetahs. If you hadn't guessed, they did a great job with their naming. And what Action for Cheetahs was dealing with is that they, throughout the process of COVID, had had a lot of turnover in their handlers. And they were at a point where they had two exquisitely trained, selected, they poured a ton of resources into these dogs. And they had this dog program to find cheetah scat for genetic monitoring of cheetahs across the country. And they didn't have any handlers left on their team. So they hired two new handlers, but now who's going to train them? They don't have any senior staff left. And I think this was a situation that a lot of NGOs ended up with because of COVID. So what we were able to do is I went to Kenya for 2 months. Rachel and Heather each went for about a month and a half, kind of staggered over the course of 5 months, I think. Um, and we were coming in and working with their handlers, Edwin and Naomi, who are both young local Kenyans, learning how to handle and train and work with these detection dogs. And it was it's such a unique experience because in most of our jobs, what we do is we drive or fly to wherever that project is. We've got our own dogs. Basically, we get out of the truck, we go do our surveys for the day, we hand off a freezer full of samples and a GPS file at the end of the survey, and like that's fantastic. That's great. This was much more, we were living out at their field camp. We were cooking together. We were talking all night, every night about the dogs and about the training and really helping the next generation of conservation dog handlers move forward and prepare for the next stage in their career. And that was just, it was so impactful. And also, I got to see a lot of wildlife I've never seen before. It was my first time in Africa. It was a hugely, hugely impactful experience for us, and really solidified as well our commitment to helping other people and other dog teams move forward in this field and helping other people get that next step, get that leg up. Because the conservation projects are amazing, and we'll talk about more of those as we go. But working with the people is also something that just makes it really special.
Yeah, I remember when you went on that trip. It was awesome that you got to go do that. So actually, this brings us up to now. You are currently working on your PhD in Alaska and are doing some really cool work. So could you share with us what exactly are you studying? What are you studying? And then how are your doggos helping find the answers?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm now a PhD student at Dr. Tal Levy's lab at Oregon State University. So I'm based out of Corvallis, Oregon now. And my PhD centers on the diet, movement, and community ecology of the Alexander archipelago wolf. So this is a subspecies of wolves, very closely related to the coastal wolves, which you may have seen in that Netflix documentary about the sea wolves. Um, Technically a different subspecies, depending on who you ask. um, but so basically, we've got a here. I'll pull up a map for us. We'll come back to that video, I promise. Well, maybe. What would it be like to not have tech issues in a Zoom presentation?
Right.
All right. I think this one is a little bit better. It's a little bit more map-like. So if you can imagine that we are looking kind of at Alaska like this, we are based down here. So this would be the part that goes out into the Bering Sea. Anchorage is somewhere in here. Fairbanks is up here. We're all the way down here, okay? And there's this island called Prince of Wales Island. That's a really big one that we see in the center of this frame. And then there are 22 different islands around this area that we're surveying. And our job is to go out with the dogs. We take a boat to our field site every day. We hop off the boat and we do a search. Sometimes we do that a couple times a day with multiple different short searches. Sometimes it's just one big search a day. And our goal is to figure out how many wolves are in this complex. So this is a game management area, which is kind of, that's what bounds what we're working with for the Alaska Department of Fish and the Game. How many wolves there are. So we can do that by finding all of these wolf scats, figuring out individual identification on them, and then basically we can do some math to figure out, okay, we probably missed a couple. How many do we think we missed? That's the mathy part later on. We also can look at what are they eating. One of the things we're really curious about is, do the wolves on bigger islands eat different things than the wolves on smaller islands? Do the wolves, does their diet change based on the logging history of these islands? There's all sorts of different variables that we might be able to look at. And then, along with one of the postdocs in my lab, we're looking at what is the genetic connectivity across these islands? Are these wolves actually swimming from island to island to make new packs and keep the gene flow happy and healthy across this ecosystem? Or do we have some islands where they're actually, we know that the Alexander Archipelago wolf broadly is relatively inbred, partially because the glaciers are gone now, and the glaciers have been gone here for, you know, thousands of years at this point. But that means that it's much harder to get back to the mainland and have more flow with the wolves in the mainland. We do know they swim, but it's a little easier to walk across ice than it is to swim through the Pacific Ocean, the Northern Pacific in particular. So it's very, very exciting. I get 3 summers of field work. So I've already done 1 season. Um, with barley, I am gearing up for, in about 5 or 6 weeks here, to go up for season number 2 with both barley and my younger dog Niffler, who's the one we saw the video of. And then in 2026, I will go up a 3rd time. That one might just be Niffler. We'll see how Barley's body is doing and whether or not he needs to move into retirement. Um, but yeah, it's very exciting. It's been a lot of fun. And I'm also actively grant writing to support a secondary project looking at the puma recolonization of El Salvador.
Oh,
So that
wow.
one is, yeah, it's not as certain, but pumas were extirpated from El Salvador in the early 1900s and have just been recorded coming back into the country. And we've been working closely with Fundación Naturaleza El Salvador to try and fundraise, grant write, figure out how to fund a project looking at the extent of the puma recolonization, what they're eating, whether or not they're reproducing, all sorts of questions related to that, because it's a really exciting little glimpse into what happens when an apex predator comes back to a landscape that it hasn't been on for decades.
Yeah, yeah. And I know, since I know your dog so well, that they are trained cat experts. So that's really, really
Yes.
exciting. But let's stay on Alaska for a little bit. Could you maybe take us through a day in the field? What is it like to go find wolf scat in a wild area?
Yeah, gosh. So, we're up and at it. We're on the boat by 7 in the morning. We've got a little 35-foot tough boat that's got kind of enclosed hull. So we're warm-ish as we're out on the boat. We've got a lovely captain named Michael who takes us where we need to go. And we're on the boat anywhere from an hour to maybe 3-ish hours in the morning to get to where we need to go. We sometimes will adjust where we need to go based on the weather and what the waves are doing, because it is not a boat that you just want to take out into, the worst that the Pacific Ocean can throw at us. We're not on Deadliest Catch. Um, though sometimes it kind of feels like it. Um, we get off the boat, we will start our GPSs, we check our radios, and then we have an idea of where we're going to search. A lot of these areas, so this is the Tongass National Forest, it's quite heavily logged. So a lot of these areas have really nice logging roads, and a lot of times we just walk the logging roads, because the cool thing about wolves is they also use the roads. They're an apex predator in this landscape. They are not shy about running into anybody else who could be around there except for humans. So they'll pretty freely use the roads, and we can just use the roads as well. We also will target sites that we know to be for high wolf activity. So sometimes we are doing much more serious bushwhacking, getting off and, just pushing through brush for a mile until we hit a muskeg, which is basically a big boggy wetland sort of thing, where the wolves historically have used as a rendezvous site, where they'll come and hang out with their adult pups and kind of get back together and reconnect as a family, and then disperse again. Every time we find a wolf scat, Barley will lie down with it in between his front paws. We'll collect it. We collect a bunch of data on data sheets about the condition and what it was around and anything else we notice about like the dog's behavior in some cases. And then we bag it up. We put it into our backpacks. So we've got very stinky backpacks all summer. And then we go on to the next one, and we kind of continue that all day until it's time to either go home, or sometimes we'll spend up to 4 days at a time camping out at some of the outer islands. So when I said that we'll spend up to like 3 hours a day on the boat, if we spent 3 hours on the way out, we're not going home that night. Usually, we'll camp somewhere.
And do you have any preliminary data, or is it still too soon to come to
Some.
any conclusions?
So I am very early in the process of. So basically, then what happens to these wolf scat samples? So we did get, I think, a couple slides from here. I've got a. Well, yeah. So basically, from here, then the scats need to come back, and we need to actually figure out what's happening with them. So we go from these piles of scat to taking teeny tiny, like a lentil-sized amount of these scats, and putting it into a tube, and then we take that back to the lab and we do a process called DNA extraction, which basically involves putting a bunch of different, it's a lot of cooking, basically. Adding a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and then you mix it, and then you strain it, and then you add a little bit of this, and then you heat it, and then, over and over. It takes about 5 hours to do 18 samples. And we ended up with almost 800 samples. So this took most of my fall. Then we end up with a teeny tiny tube with like less than a raindrop worth of liquid that contains all of our DNA. And that includes both the DNA of the wolf and the DNA of anything that wolf ate that was within that scat sample. Then we do a process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. It's the same thing that we did for our COVID tests, those ones that took like a week or so. And that helps us identify the donor, so that it was a wolf and what was in it. From there, then we can do a process called genotyping, which I haven't learned yet, so I don't know as much about, but that will actually allow us to identify the individual wolf. I'll be learning that here in April. Then from there, we can start actually doing the analysis of which wolves are where and what are they eating, and like, does this individual wolf have a different diet than that other wolf, or like, do the wolves on this island have different diets than those wolves, and does that relate to the population of sea otters in the area or something like that. So I haven't done the vast majority of that yet. I'm currently at the identify donor and diet stage of this process. But one of the things that I can tell you from our first season, so this is basically a heat map. Anywhere that you see that pink turning into orange or yellow is somewhere where we found over 100 scats, and they're aggregated. The little bullseyes are places that we placed camera traps. We haven't had the chance to check those yet, so we don't know what's on them yet, but it's going to be very exciting. Over the course of our field season last summer, we covered 534 kilometers. We searched
That's a
22
lot.
islands. We had one detection distance where the dog actually located something from over 100 meters away. We spent about 200 hours on a boat. We found just shy of 800 scat samples. 76% of our scats were found by the dog as opposed to found by the person. And we were doing tests where we would place scats out and do what we call searcher efficiency trials or searcher efficacy tests to see how good the dog was at finding stuff when we knew it was out there. And he found about 84% of them. And then this is just a note. There was a specific island that was known to not have wolves, and we got a couple scats on them. I can say now that those scats were actually river otter. So
No.
we did not discover wolves on the island that was not supposed to have wolves, unfortunately.
Wow. Yeah, talk about a lot of work. The heat map is really cool. Very, very exciting. And it's also so exciting to sit down with you in the middle of all of this so you can come back and tell us more and more exciting things as you discover them. Yeah, so since we are getting closer to the end, everybody start thinking of your questions so we can have some time with Kayla here in a little bit. So remember that little chat function, put your questions in there so I can ask them to Kayla, because since we're getting towards the end of my portion with Kayla. But I do think that this is an important question as we are looking into the future of conservation science. And now that conservation detection dogs is becoming more and more of a used technique in the field. Um, what do you think is the future for this field? And are there any emerging technologies or methods that could enhance this work specifically, do you think?
Yeah, I think what we have already started seeing in my lifetime, which is really exciting, is so I shared that when I was starting to get into the conservation detection dog world and I was emailing people asking for internships, asking to volunteer, I got nowhere. I actually had quite a few pretty discouraging responses from people, basically telling me, you'll never make it, kid. um, that's not what we see in the field already. So it's only been, I guess, about 10 years since I was the one sending those emails. And what we see now is there has been a shift. The conservation dog world has gotten much more collaborative and much more open. And I think it's because there is getting to be a little bit more stability in the field. Previously, I think there was a lot of protectiveness over the field because it was so new. There was a lot of concern that by welcoming a newcomer into the field, you might lose out on a gig, you might lose out on a project. And we're seeing the field mature a lot more beyond that, which is really exciting because it's conservation is a crisis discipline and we need more people doing this sort of work. And there's a lot of people and a lot of dogs that will make excellent teams and can make a real change and make a real impact in this world, um, who just need the next step and just need some support. So it's been really exciting to see that shift already happening. We, in the last month, had the first ever conservation detection dog conference in the US. Like, so this is really, it is like happening right now, that we're seeing that. The other thing that I think we're seeing is going back to this idea of non-invasive genetic sampling. Um, and as these techniques just keep getting better and faster and cheaper, and we can do more and more and more with scat, I think we are going to continue seeing the dogs grow alongside that genetic sampling. Because again, like if you think even like 5 years ago, a lot of the work that I just described doing in Alaska would be prohibitively expensive and it would take too long and we wouldn't even have enough resolution. So we wouldn't necessarily be able to say how many individuals there were. And actually right now, we can't yet say how related these individuals are. That's a postdoc in my lab who is developing those techniques like literally as we speak. Um, and as we're able to answer more and more complicated and interesting questions with the genetic side of things, the dogs are just going to get more and more useful. Which is, I think, the lab that I'm in is a genetics lab. I'm the dog person in the genetics lab, and it's such a cool place to get to be. Um, I think also with that, we're not likely to see the dogs getting put out of business for a while. I think things like medical detection dogs, like if you've heard of the dogs that are trained to sniff out cancer, I think it's quite likely that other tests are going to eclipse detection dogs in our lifetime with some of those things. But this sort of stuff where we need the dogs to be weatherproof, waterproof, mudproof, they're all-terrain vehicles. They carry themselves over, all these rocks up and over my head and pushing through vegetation. Even if we do manage to create an instrument that's just as good at the dogs at locating the scent of wolf scat on the air, somebody's got to carry that. It's probably not going to be waterproof. If you drop it, it'll break. Um, the dogs, I think, are going to last a really long time in the field.
Yeah. Talk about job security for you at least. That's which of course I love.
Hopefully, yeah.
Um, and so of course I absolutely love asking this question. So I am starting to get some good questions, everybody. I can't wait to ask them to Kayla. But before anybody hops off and before we move on, how can listeners support canine conservationists and the work that you're doing? Do you have a website, anything like that?
Yeah. So, to start out with, we are a 501(c)(3). We are a nonprofit. You can just donate to us. We would love to accept your donations. Those are tax deductible. The other thing that what we're really looking for right now is we're kind of in still the early stages of growth. As I said, Canine Conservationists has only existed for about 4 years. We're actively trying to build our board and build connections with fundraisers and donors and people who know how to build an organization from where we currently are, where we've got 3 co-founders, we've got 4 dogs. Our dream is to be in a place where we have a facility and we have a home base and we can host courses and educational workshops we can bring in shelter dogs that have promise but maybe don't yet have a home with us, and we can train them and we can prepare them, and then we can donate them to another conservation project, or we can match them with a handler, maybe in a different state, maybe in a different country, and really help kind of magnify this force that we already have. And there's a lot between where we are right now and actually getting to that point, but we're actively looking for people who are willing to maybe help us figure out what those next steps might be. And if you're interested, I'll put my email up. All of always happy to hear back from people. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess the last thing that I'll also mention, because I don't think we've talked about this at all, is one of the other missions that we have within Canine Conservationists is not just to train the dogs and to train the people and go out and do the field work. We also are the first organization within basically within the conservation dog world to offer affordable ongoing education within the world of conservation detection dogs. So we are really passionate about helping people get that step up, get that leg up, and get into the field. So we offer a couple different mentoring programs and courses and dog training programs to help people move forward, which is again where when we think about like this dream of having a facility one day, being able to let people come and bring their dogs and work with us for a week at a time and not having to book a venue for that is something that would be massive for us and really, really helpful for these conservation programs literally around the world. We've got students in, I think, 70 different countries currently. Um, and being able to actually help them out more concretely is just one of our biggest goals. So
Such
I'll
a
put up that
beautiful
email.
mission. Such a beautiful
Yes.
mission. I definitely love canine conservationists, and I'm so excited and happy to be able to show everybody all of your amazing work. So, all right, everybody, let's go ahead and move to questions. We are getting lots of really good ones here. Oh, this is a good one. So, what do you do, Kayla, when you're getting ready to go to a project and you don't have the animal to work with? So, like cheetahs, for example. How do you train your dogs on cheetahs when there's not cheetahs around?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the first questions we ask any prospective partner for a project. Is okay, great. You want us to find ocelot scat. Do you happen to have a freezer full of ocelot scat? And if they say no, that's fine. We've got other options. So I have been known to get onto Google Scholar and try to figure out who else is researching ocelots with feces and connect with them and ask if they've got samples. We will reach out to zoos, captive breeding programs. In some cases, if it's something like black bears, we might be able to just like go out our back door and find black bear scat if we, just know more or less the right trail to go to. But yeah, generally we hope that the researcher who already is working with that study species has some connections, has some options for us, and we will also go like the captive route if needed.
Awesome. Yeah, very, very helpful. Remember you going about that
Yeah.
in your own way. Oh, we're getting lots of really good questions, everyone. Great. Good. This is a cool one to hop dog uses, I guess. Um, do your dogs, or do you know of dogs that also do this kind of work for wildlife trafficking and stopping that industry?
Yeah. Yeah, that's relatively common. We don't have as much of it here in the US, although I've got a good friend who has a dog that is trained to detect bear gallbladders and worked in the
Mhm.
port of Tacoma doing that sort of work. But yeah, primarily, especially overseas, I know Kazakhstan actually has, or maybe it's Kyrgyzstan, has detection dogs at their borders that are trained to detect live falcons because that's such a huge problem. Obviously, if you get into some of the African nations, both at parks and at international borders, I know of quite a few programs that train dogs to detect ivory, bushmeat, cat skins, those sorts of things. And I've got another good friend who works in South Africa who works with her dogs do succulent detection because the illegal succulent trade is such a huge problem in South Africa. So really, really interesting, neat stuff there.
Yeah, wow. I mean, dogs are just so adaptable. And speaking of adaptability, so can the same dog be used for multiple projects? And if so, how do you untrain and then retrain them for a new project?
Yeah. Oh gosh, this is such a great question. So yes, you can use the same dog for multiple projects. Barley, I think at this point knows something around 20 different target odors. And we don't untrain them on an old project. Instead, what we do is whenever we get an inquiry for a new project and we're starting to work with that scientist, we're starting to plan which dog team is going out, we're always kind of carefully layering which targets complement each other and don't compete with each other. So we wouldn't necessarily want the same dog to be trained on Wolverine scat and coyote scat because you're going to find like 100 coyote scats to every one Wolverine scat, and they're going to be in kind of similar environments. That would be kind of nightmarish. But we would happily have a dog that's trained on cougar, Wolverine, and maybe even black bear because you can see the black bear scat and like move on. And it's not going to be a problem at all for a dog to be trained on cheetah, jaguar, and wolverine because you're never going to run into those species in the same areas. So it mostly gets to be a problem with things like coyote or bobcat where they're really, really widespread across North America. They do have quite a bit of interest behind them, but we might not necessarily want to put a dog onto one of those target odors because then when we take them out to do the next project, they're going to continue finding that thing for the rest of their lives, and that can slow us down or just uh, it can make things complicated. It's not a deal breaker, but it can make things complicated.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Great. So I think this is the last question I'll ask since we're almost to the top of the hour here. This is a really good asking about your relationship with shelters. Do you work with a lot of them directly? And if so, like, are they on standby to alert you when maybe they have found a dog, or do you actively go out and reach them? But how does that relationship work from the very beginning?
Yeah, it goes both ways. So because I have a history of working in animal shelters, and actually both Rachel and Heather do as well, we have a lot of connections. Um, we are such a small organization that we don't necessarily have the ability to bring in new dogs just at any point yet. So we will get inquiries from shelters saying, "Hey, we think we've got a really good candidate for you." So far, none of those have worked out for us because we just haven't had a spot for them in our program because every single dog we bring on is a 15-year commitment. That's what we assume. And every single dog we bring on, that's veterinary care, that's food, that's training, that's time, that's space in your home. We can't just acquire more dogs just because a dog is a great candidate, which is hard. So generally it's more we actually reach out to shelters when we are looking, and that can be a little bit more effective for us. We have a couple partners in particular when we know that we've got maybe a former coworker of somebody's or a friend who is kind of already trained on how to screen these dogs. We'll reach out to them first because they already kind of know what we're looking for and know how to screen.
Well, awesome. Well, that is the last question that we will take. So, Kayla, I would love to turn it to you for any last closing comments.
I don't think I have any. I do have a really cute video that I usually play at the end of this talk. So I'll go ahead and let this one go. So this is the first time Barley had ever seen a whale. Um, and he was so terribly excited to go try to bring it his stick. Um, so just, just to leave you with a little bit of cuteness, that is one of the wildlife that we will allow the dogs to approach is a whale.
No problems there. Barley will be just fine in that situation. You can show all of your
If he
sticks,
started swimming
Barley.
out towards the whale, we might have a problem. We'd have a conversation if it was an orca and he was going after it.
Awesome. Well, Kayla, thank you so much for everything. Thank you for being a friend of mine. Thank you for taking the time to come and teach about your amazing work to everybody, to the NetHab community. And I'm getting lots of comments in here also thanking you. So we all just very much appreciate your time. And I would also like to thank everybody who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.